Story 7 of Cape Cod Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by David Wales. Cape Cod Stories by Joseph C. Lincoln. Story 7, The Love of Lobelia Ankins. Obed's yarn being done, and friend Davidson done too, and brown at that, Peter T. passed around another relay of cigars, and we lit up. 'Twas Captain Airy that spoke first. "Love's a queer disease, anyway," says he. "Ain't it, now? 'Twould puzzle you and me to figure out what that Saunders girl see to like in the Davidson critter. It must be a dreadful responsible thing to be so fascinating. I never felt that responsibleness but once, except when I got married, of course, and that was a good many years ago when I was going to sea on long voyages and was cruising around the East Indies in the latitude of our new troubles, the Philippines. I put in about 3 months in one of them little coral islands off that way once. Hottest corner in the Lord's creation, I cal'late, and the laziest and sleepiest hole ever I struck. All a feller feels like doing in them islands is just to lay on his back under a palm tree all day and eat custard apples and such truck. Way I come to be there was like this. I was fo'mast hand on a Boston hooker bound to Singapore after rice. The captain's name was Perkins, Malachi C. Perkins, and he was the meanest man that ever wore a southwester. I've had the pleasure of telling him so since. 'Twas in Surinam, long in '72. Well, anyhow, Perkins fed us on spiled salt junk and wormy hardtack all the way out, and if a feller dast to hint that the same wa'n't precisely what you call Parker House fare, why, the captain would knock him down with a marlinspike and the first mate would kick him up and down the deck. 'Twa'n't a pretty performance to look at, but it beat the world for taking the craving for fancy cooking out of a man. Well, when I got to Singapore I was nothing but skin and bone, and considerable of the skin had been knocked off by the marlinspike and the mate's boots. I'd shipped for the voyage out and back, but the first night in port I slipped over the side, swum ashore, and never set eyes on old Perkins again till that time in Surinam years afterward. I knocked around them Singapore docks for much as a month, hoping to get a berth on some other ship, but 'twa'n't no go. I fell in with a Britisher named Hammond. Hammond, he called it, and as he was on the same hunt that I was, we kept each other company. We done odd jobs now and again, and slept in sailors' lodging houses when we had the price, and under bridge or on the hemp bales when we hadn't. I was too proud to write home for money, and Hammond didn't have no home to write to, I cal'late. But luck'll turn if you give it time enough. One night Hammond come hurrying round to my sleeping room, that is to say, my hemp bale, and gives me a shake, and says he, "Turn out, you mud 'ead, I got you a berth." Go west," says I, and turned over to go to sleep again. But he pulled me off the bale by the leg, and that woke me up so I sensed what he was saying. Seems he'd found a feller that wanted to ship a couple of fo'mast hands on a little trading schooner for a trip over to the Java Sea. Well, to make a long story short, we shipped with this feller, whose name was Lazarus. I cal'late if the Lazarus in Scripture had been up to as many tricks and had come as nigh being a thief as our Lazarus was, he wouldn't have been so poor. Ourn was a shrewd rascal and nothing more nor less than a pearl poacher. He didn't tell us that till after we sot sail, but we was so desperate I don't know as 'twould have made much difference if he had. We cruised around for a spell, sort of prospecting, and then we landed at a little one-horse coral island where there wa'n't no inhabitants, but where we was pretty dead sartin there was pearl oyster banks in the lagoon. There was 5 of us on the schooner, a Dutchman named Rhinelander, a coolie cook, and Lazarus and Hammond and me. We put up a slab shanty on shore and went to work pearl fishing, keeping one eye out for Dutch gunboats, and always having a sago palm ready to split open so's if we got caught we could say we was after sago. Well, we done fairly good at the pearl fishing. got together quite a likely mess of pearls, and as 'twas part of the agreement that the crew had a certain share in the stake, why, Hammond and me was figuring that we was going to make enough to more'n pay us for our long spell of starving at Singapore. Lazarus was feeling pretty middling chipper. The cook was feeding us high, and everything looked lovely. Rhinelander and the coolie and the skipper used to sleep aboard the boat, but Hammond and me liked to sleep ashore in the shanty. For one thing, the bunks on the schooner wa'n't none too clean, and the coolie snored so that he'd shake the whole cabin and start me dreaming about cyclones and cannons firing and lions roaring and all kinds of foolishness. I always did hate a snorer. One morning me and Hammond come out of the shanty, and lo and behold you, there wa'n't no schooner to be seen. That everlasting Lazarus had put up a job on us and had sneaked off in the night with the cook and the Dutchman, and took our share of the pearls with him. I s'pose he'd cal'lated to do it from the very first. Anyway, there we was, marooned on that little 2-for-a-cent island. The first day we didn't do much but cuss Lazarus up hill and down dale. Hammond was the best at that kind of business ever I see. He invented more'n 400 new kind of names for the gang on the schooner, and every one of them was brimstone blue. We had fish lines in the shanty, and there was plenty of water on the island, so we knew we wouldn't starve to death nor die of thirst anyhow. I've mentioned that 'twas hot in them parts. Well, that island was the hottest of 'em all. Whew! Don't talk! And more'n that, the weather was the kind that makes you feel it's a barrel of work to live. First day we fished and slept. Next day we fished less and slept more. Third day 'twas too everlasting hot even to sleep, so we set around in the shade and fought flies and jawed each other. Main trouble was who was going to get the meals. Land, how we did miss that coolie cook! "Why don't you get to work and cook something fit to eat?" says Hammond. "'Ere I broke my bloomin' back, allin' in the fish, and you do nothing but 'anging round and letting 'em dry hup in the 'eat. Get to work and cook. Blimed if I ain't sick of these here custard apples." "Go and cook yourself," says I. "I didn't sign articles to be cook for no Johnny Bull." Well, we jawed back and forth for an hour, maybe more. 2 or 3 times we got up to have it out, but 'twas too hot to fight, so we set down again. Finally we eat some supper, custard apples and water, and turned in. But 'twas too hot to sleep much, and I got up about 3 o'clock in the morning and went out and set down on the beach in the moonlight. Pretty soon out comes Hammond and sets down alongside and begins to give the weather a general overhauling, calling it everything he could lay tongue to. Pretty soon he breaks off in the middle of a 9-jinted swear word and sings out, "Am I going crazy, or is that a schooner?" I looked out into the moonlight, and there, sure enough, was a schooner about a mile off the island and coming dead on. First off we thought 'twas Lazarus coming back, but pretty soon we see 'twas a considerable smaller boat than his. We forgot all about how hot it was and hustled out on the reef right at the mouth of the lagoon. I had a coat on a stick, and I waved it for a signal, and Hammond set to work building a bonfire. We got a noble one blazing, and then him and me stood and watched the schooner. She was acting dreadful queer. First she'd go ahead on one tack, and then give a heave over and come about with a bang, sails flapping and everything of a shake. Then she'd give another slat and go off another way, but mainly she kept right on toward the island. "What's the matter aboard there?" said Hammond. "Is Hall 'Ands drunk?" "She's abandoned," says I. "That's what's the matter. There ain't nobody aboard of her." Then we both says, "Salvage!" and shook hands. The schooner came nearer and nearer. It begun to look as if she'd smash against the rocks in front of us, but she didn't. When she got opposite the mouth of the lagoon, she heeled over on a new tack and sailed in between the rocks as pretty as anything ever you see. Then she run aground on the beach just about a quarter of a mile from the shanty. 'Twas early morning when we climbed aboard of her. I thought Lazarus' schooner was dirty, but this one was nothing but dirt. Dirty sails, all patches, dirty deck, dirty everything. "Won't get much salvage on this bally tub," says Hammond. "She's one of them nigger fish boats, that's what she is." I was kind of skittish about going below, 'fraid there might be some dead folks, but Hammond went. In a minute or so up he comes, looking scary. "There's something mighty queer down there," says he. "Kind of wheezing like a puffing pig." "Wheezing your grandmother," says I. But I went and listened at the hatch. 'Twas a funny noise I heard, but I knew what it was in a minute. I'd heard too much of it lately to forget it right away. "It's snoring," says I. "Somebody snoring." "'Eavens!" says Hammond. "You don't s'pose it's that 'ere coolie come back?" "No, no," says I. "Where's your common sense? The cook snored bass. This critter's snoring sopraner, and mighty poor sopraner at that." "Well," says he, "'ere goes to wake 'em up." And he commenced to holler, "Ahoy! and belay there!" down the hatch. First thing we heard was a kind of thump, like somebody jumping out of her bed. Then footsteps running like, then up the hatchway comes a sight I shan't forget if I live to be 100. 'Twas a woman, middling old, with a yeller face all wrinkles and a chin and nose like Punch. She was dressed in a gaudy old calico gown and had earrings in her ears. She give one look round at the schooner and the island. Then she see us and let out a whoop like a steam whistle. "Mulligatawny Sacramento merlasses!" she yells. Course that wa'n't what she said, but that's what it sounded like. Then, 'fore Hammond could stop her, she run for him and give him a rousing big hug. He was the most surprised man ever you'd see stood there like a wooden image. I commenced to laugh, but the next minute the woman come for me and hugged me, too. "'Fectionate old gal," says Hammond, grinning. The critter in the calico gown was going through the craziest pantomime ever was, p'inting off to sea and then down to deck and then up to the sails. I didn't catch on for a minute, but Hammond did. Says he: "Showing us where this 'ere palatial yacht come from. Had a rough passage, it looks like." Then the old gal commenced to get excited. She panted over the side and made motions like rowing. Then she panted down the hatch and shut her eyes and pretended to snore. After that she rowed again, all the time getting madder and madder, with her little black eyes a snapping like fire coals, and stomping her feet and shaking her fists. Finally she finished up with a regular howl, you might say of rage. "The crew took to the boat and left her asleep below," says Hammond. "'Oly scissors! They're in for a lively time if old Nutcrackers here ever catches 'em, eh?" Well, we went over the schooner and examined everything, but there wa'n't nothing of any value nowheres. 'Twas a regular nigger fishing boat, with dirt and cockroaches by the pailful. At last we went ashore again and up to the shanty, taking the old woman with us. After eating some more of them tiresome custard apples for breakfast, Hammond and me went down to look over the schooner again. We found she'd started a plank running aground on the beach, and that 'twould take us a week to get her afloat and watertight. While we was doing this the woman come down and went aboard. Pretty soon we see her going back to the shanty with her arms full of bundles and truck. We didn't think anything of it, of course, but when we got home at noon there was the best dinner ever you see all ready for us. Fried fish and some kind of beans cooked up with peppers, and tea, real store tea, and a lot more things. Land, how we did eat! We kept smacking our lips and rubbing our vests to show we was enjoying everything, and the old gal kept bobbing her head and grinning like one of them dummies you wind up with a key. "Well," says Hammond, "we've got a cook at last. Ain't we, blimed if we've got a name for her yet. Here," says he, pointing to me. "Looky here, missus. Edge, that's him. Ammond, that's me. Now, 'oo are you?" She rattled off a name that had more double gents in it than an eel. "Lordy!" says I. "We never can learn that rigmarole, I tell you. She looks for all the world like old Aunt Lobelia Fosdick at home down on Cape Cod. Let's call her that." She looks to me like the mother of a oysterman I used to know in Liverpool. His name was Ankins. Let's split the difference and call her Lobelia Ankins." So we done it. Well, Hammond and me pounded and patched away at the schooner for the next 3 or 4 days, taking plenty of time off to sleep in, 'count of the heat, but getting along fairly well. Lobelia 'Ankins cooked and washed dishes for us. She done some noble cooking, especially as we wa'n't particular, but we could see she had a temper to beat the old scratch. If anything got burned, or if the kettle upset, she'd howl and stomp and scatter things worse than a cyclone. I reckon 'twas about the 3rd day that I noticed she was getting sweet on Hammond. She was giving him the best of all the vittles, and used to set at the table and look at him softer'n, sweeter'n a bucket of molasses. Used to walk alongside of him, too, and look up in his face and smile. I could see that he noticed it, and that it was worrying him a heap. One day he says to me, "Edge," says he, "I b'lieve that here chromo of a Lobelia 'Ankins is getting soft on me." "'Course she is," says I. "I see that a long spell ago." "But what'll I do?" says he. "A woman like 'er is a desperate character. If we hever get her ashore, she might be for lugging me to the church and marrying me by main force." "Then you'll have to marry her, for all I see," says I. "You shouldn't be so fascinating." That made him mad, and he went off jawing to himself. The next day we got the schooner patched up and off the shoal and alongside Lazarus' old landing wharf by the shanty. There was a little more tinkering to be done 'fore she was ready for sea, and we calculated to do it that afternoon. After dinner Hammond went down to the spring for some water, and Lobelia 'Ankins went along with him. I laid down in the shade for a snooze, but I hadn't much more than settled myself comfortably when I heard a yell and somebody running. I jumped up just in time to see Hammond come busting through the bushes, lickety smash, with Lobelia after him, yelling like an Injun. Hammond wa'n't yelling. He was saving his breath for running. They wa'n't in sight more'n a minute, but went smashing and crashing through the woods into the distance. 'Twas too hot to run after 'em, so I waited a spell and then loafed off in a roundabout direction toward where I see 'em go. After I'd walked pretty nigh a mile, I heard Hammond whistle. I looked, but didn't see him nowheres. Then he whistled again, and I see his head sticking out of the top of a palm tree. "Is she gone?" says he. "Yes, long ago," says I. "Come down." It took some coaxing to get him down, but he come after a spell, and he was the scaredest man ever I see. I asked him what the matter was. "Edge," says he, "I'm a lost man. That here 'orrible 'Ankins outrage is either going to marry me or kill me. Edge," he says, awful solemn, "she tried to kiss me. S'help me, she did." Well, I set back and laughed. "Is that why you run away?" I says. "No," says he. "When I wouldn't let her, she hups with a rock as big as my 'ed and goes for me. There was murder in her eyes, Edge. I see it." Then I laughed more than ever and told him to come back to the shanty, but he wouldn't. He swore he'd never come back again while Lobelia 'Ankins was there. "That's it," says he. "Larf at a feller critter's sufferings. I honly wish she'd try to kiss you once, that's all." Well, I couldn't make him budge, so I decided to go back and get the lay of the land. Lobelia was busy inside the shanty when I got there and looked black as a thundercloud. So I judged 'twa'n't best to say nothing to her, and I went down and finished the job on the schooner. At night, when I come in to suppers, she met me at the door. She had a big stick in her hand and looked savage. I was a little nervous. "Now, Lobelia 'Ankins," says I, "put down that and be sociable, there's a good girl." Course, I knew she couldn't understand me, but I was whistling to keep my courage up, as the saying is. "'Ammond," says she, panting toward the woods. "Yes," says I. "'Ammond's taking a walk for his health." "'Ammond," says she, louder, and shaking the stick. "Now, Lobelia," says I, smiling smooth as butter, "do put down that club." "'Ammond!" she fairly hollers. Then she went through the most blood curdling pantomime ever was, I reckon. First she comes up to me and taps me on the chest and says, "Edge." Then she goes creeping round the room on tiptoe, p'inting out of the winder all the time, as much as to say she was pretending to walk through the woods. Then she p'ints to one of the stumps we used for chairs and screeches, "'Ammond!" and fetches the stump an awful bang with the club. Then she comes over to me and kind of snuggles up and smiles and says, "Edge," and tried to put the club in my hand. My topknot riz up on my head. Good Lord, thinks I, she's making love to me, so's to get me to take that club and go and thump Hammond with it. I was scared stiff, but Lobelia was between me and the door, so I kept smiling and backing away. "Now, Lobelia," says I, "don't be—" "'Ammond," says she. "Now, Miss Ankins, don't be hasty. "'Ammond." Well, I backed faster and faster, and she follered me right up till at last I begun to run. Round and round the place we went, me scart for my life and she fairly frothing with rage. Finally I burst through the door and put for the woods at a rate that beat Hammond's going all holler. I never stopped till I got close to the palm tree. Then I whistled, and Hammond answered. When I told him about the rumpus, he sat and laughed like an idiot. "How'd you like Miss Ankins' love making?" he says. "You'll like it less'n I do," I says, "if she gets up here with that club." That kind of sobered him down again, and we got to planning. After a spell we decided that our only chance was to sneak down to the schooner in the dark and put to sea, leaving Lobelia alone in her glory. Well, we waited till 12 o'clock or so, and then we crept down to the beach, tiptoeing past the shanty for fear of waking Lobelia. We got on the schooner all right, hauled up anchor, hoisted sail, and stood out of the lagoon with a fair wind. When we was fairly to sea we shook hands. "Lord!" says Hammond, drawing a long breath, "I never was so 'appy in my life. This here lady killing business ain't in my line." It felt so good that he sat by the wheel and sung "Good by, sweetheart, good by" for an hour or more. In the morning we was in sight of another small island, and out on a p'int was a passel of folks jumping up and down and waving a signal. "Well, if there ain't more castaways," says I. "Don't go near 'em," says Hammond. "Might come there was more Lobelias among them." But pretty quick we see the crowd all pile into a boat and come rowing off to us. They was all men, and their signal was a red flannel shirt on a pole. We put about for 'em and picked 'em up, letting their boat tow behind the schooner. There was 5 of 'em, a ragged and dirty lot of Malays and half breeds. When they first climbed aboard I see 'em looking the schooner over mighty sharp, and in a minute they was all jabbering together in native lingo. "What's the matter with 'em?" asked Hammond. A chap with scraggy black whiskers and a sort of worried look on his face stepped for'ard and made a bow. He looked like a cross between a Spaniard and a Malay, and I guess that's what he was. "Senors," says he, palavering and scraping, "boat, my boat." "What's he giving us?" says Hammond. "Boat, this boat, my boat, senors," says the feller. All to once I understood him. "Hammond," I says, "I swan to man if I don't believe we've picked up the real crew of this craft." "Si, senor, boat, my boat, crew, crew," says Whiskers, waving his hands towards the rest of his gang. "All right, skipper," says Hammond. "Glad to see you're back aboard. Make yourselves well at home. How'd you lose her in the first place?" The feller didn't seem to understand much of this, but he looked more worried than ever. The crew looked frightened and jabbered. "Ooman, senors," says Whiskers at half whisper. "Ooman, she here?" "Hammond," says I, "what's a ooman?" The feller seemed to be thinking a minute. Then he began to make signs. He pulled his nose down till it most touched his chin. Then he put his hands to his ears and made loops of his fingers to show earrings. And then he took off his coat and wrapped it around his knees like make-believe skirts. Hammond and me looked at each other. "Edge," says Hammond, "he wants to know what's become of Lobelia 'Ankins." "No, senor," says I to the feller. "Ooman no here. Ooman there." And I panted in the direction of our island. Well, sir, you oughter have seen that Malay gang's faces light up. They all bust out a grinning and laughing, and Whiskers fairly hugged me and then Hammond. Then he made one of the Malays take the wheel instead of me, and sent another one into the forecastle after something. But I was curious, and I says, p'inting toward Lobelia's island, "Ooman your wife?" "No, no, no, no," says he, shaking his head like it would come off. "Ooman no wife. Wife there," and he panted about directly opposite from my way. "Ooman," he goes on, "she no wife. She—" Just here the Malay come up from the forecastle, grinning like a chessy cat and hugging a fat jug of this here palm wine that natives make. I don't know where he got it from. I thought Hammond and me had rummaged that forecastle pretty good. But, anyhow, there it was. Whiskers passed the jug to me, and I handed it over to Hammond. He stood up to make a speech. "Feller citizens," says he, "I rise to drink a toast. 'Ere's to the beauteous Lobelia Ankins, and may she long hornament that lovely island where she now—" The Malay at the wheel behind us gave an awful screech. We all turned sudden, and there, standing in the companion ladder, with her head and shoulders out of the hatch, was Lobelia Ankins, as large as life and twice as natural. Hammond dropped the jug, and it smashed into finders. We all stood stock still for a minute, like folks in a tableau. The half-breed skipper stood next to me, and I snum if you couldn't see him shrivel up like one of them things they call a sensitive plant. The tableau lasted while a feller might count 5. Then things happened. Hammond and me dodged around the deck house. The Malays broke and run, 1 up the main rigging, 2 down the forecastle hatch, and 1 out on the jib boom. But the poor skipper wa'n't satisfied with any of them places. He started for the lee rail, and Lobelia Ankins started after him. She caught him as he was going to jump overboard, and yanked him back like he was a bag of meal. She shook him, she boxed his ears, she pulled his hair, and all the time he was begging and pleading, and she was screeching and jabbering at the top of her lungs. Hammond pulled me by the sleeve. "It'll be our turn next," says he. "Get into the boat, quick." The little boat that the crew had come in was towing behind the schooner. We slid over the stern and dropped into it. Hammond cut the tow line, and we laid to the oars. Long as we was in the hearing of the schooner the powwow and rumpus kept up, but just as we was landing on the little island that the Malays had left, she come about on the port tack and stood off to sea. "Lobelia's running things again," says Hammond. 3 days after this we was took off by a Dutch gunboat. Most of the time on the island we spent debating how Lobelia come to be on the schooner. Finally we decided that she must have gone aboard to sleep that night, suspecting that we'd try to run away in the schooner just as we had tried to. We talked about Whiskers and his crew, and guessed about how they came to abandon their boat in the first place. One thing we was sartin sure of, and that was that they'd left Lobelia aboard on purpose. We knew mighty well that's what we'd have done. What puzzled us most was what relation Lobelia was to the skipper. She wa'n't his wife, 'cause he'd said so, and she didn't look enough like him to be his mother or sister. But as we was being took off in the Dutchman's yawl, Hammond thumps the thwart with his fist, and says he, "I've got it," he says. "She's his mother-in-law." "'Course she is," says I. "We might have known it." End of Story 7